Welcome to Red Star Over Asia, everyone. We've been on a bit of a break recently, but all of the co-hosts are now back in South Korea, hence on the same time zone. So we hope to increase the frequency of upcoming episodes. We appreciate all of you listening, and we are sorry for the gap. We appreciate you sticking with us. For this first episode of our Season 2 launch, we have an epic two-part episode on Cuba. So you might be asking yourself, this is Red Star Over Asia. This is supposed to be a podcast about politics in Asia. Why is there an episode about Cuba? Well, there's a few reasons. First off, the Cuban Revolution has had a profound impact all over the world. Not only in Latin America, but Cuba historically supported anti-colonial movements in Asia, Africa, and the Cuban experience has a lot of lessons for socialists anywhere on the globe. They have attempted to build a socialist project under extremely difficult, arduous circumstances. So there are a lot of lessons to learn. And that is why we invited on our friend Rodrigo Huamachi. He is based in Havana, Cuba. He is a member of the Cuban Communist Party. We invited him on the show to talk about how the Chinese and Vietnamese models are influencing debates within the Cuban Communist Party. Contrary to what you may hear, the Cuban Communist Party actually has vibrant internal factional debate. They are figuring out how to move forward and adapt socialism for new circumstances in the 21st century. And there's a lot of things to talk about in terms of how looking at the Chinese and Vietnamese models are influencing how those conversations are happening within the party. Since the fall of the USSR and the socialist bloc in the early 90s, there was a long night where Cuba was in a very difficult period. But with the Bolivarian wave, the so-called pink tide with Venezuela, Bolivia, etc., this reinfused the Cuban project with new energy and new insight and new debates about what socialism means in this new century. So that is what anchored our conversation. But there's also a lot here about just the history and the legacy of the Cuban Revolution. So even if you don't know anything about Cuba, you're going to get a great overview because Rodrigo is a fabulous storyteller. And the reason this is a two-part episode is because we weren't going to stop him when he was on fire, which he was the entire time. So we go everywhere from a deep dive on the history of the Cuban Revolution, which he is insistent that it starts way before even Spanish independence and goes far up into the present, into the future. We talk a lot about how the Cuban political and electoral system actually works, how Cuban democracy actually works. And again, Rodrigo Huamachi, he's a member of the Cuban Communist Party. He's a grassroots activist, independent researcher, and translator based in Havana, Cuba. I really hope you guys enjoy this. I'm sure you will. And stay tuned for part 2, which will be coming next week. All right, thanks, comrades. Welcome everyone to Red Star Over Asia. And today we have a very special guest, Rodrigo Huamachi, good personal friend and comrade of mine from Havana, Cuba. Lately, Cuba has been in the news. As you would expect in the corporate media, you're getting one side of the story about what's happening in Cuba. So Cuba has been strangled by the tightening of the U.S. embargo, which has been going on for 60 some odd years. And the U.S. has been using this as an opportunity to destabilize the island. But Rodrigo here today is a Cuban Communist Party member. He is very active politically within Cuba. And he's here to join us today to talk about a lot of different things, but primarily how the experience of the Chinese and Vietnamese models are influencing debates within the Cuban Communist Party about how to move forward and adapt Cuban socialism to new circumstances in the world. Because contrary to what you may hear in the US media, Cuba actually has a very vibrant political life with a lot of diversity of political opinion. There are a lot of very interesting debates going on within Cuba about how to reconceptualize socialism for the 21st century. So Rodrigo is joining us to talk about that and also topics such as Cuba's support and relationship to anti-colonial movements in Asia. We're going to talk about a variety of different things. So we're very excited to have him on the show. First off, I'm Mike here in Busan, South Korea. Joining us as always are our co-hosts. We have Jay in Seoul, currently in quarantine. He just arrived back to the mother country of Korea. How are you doing? How's it going up there?
Bad, but good.
Bad but good, okay. Also in Seoul, we have Bori. How you doing, Bori?
Hey guys.
And also in Seoul, I'm alone here in Busan, we have Jack. How are you doing, Jack?
How you doing, comrades? Just keeping myself busy.
Sounds good. All right, and our special guest, Rodrigo Huamachi. So, as I said, he is based in Havana, Cuba. He is an activist in the Cuban Communist Party, has a lot of interesting things to say. I met him years ago. Great guy, and we're really happy to have him on the show. So, Rodrigo, tell us a little bit more about yourself. So tell us about, where did you grow up in Cuba? How did you get engaged in politics? Kind of walk us through who you are.
Sure. Hi, Mike. Hi, everyone. Greetings from Havana, Cuba. This is the morning in Cuba, a Sunday morning, a very peaceful morning, very hot. We're in summertime here. So greetings for everyone. Well, my name is Rodrigo Huamachi. As you said, I live here in the eastern part of Havana. Havana is a city of 2.2 million inhabitants and the capital of Cuba. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I got involved in politics very early in my life due to my parents who were involved during the 1960s, the agrarian reform and the social changes that happened during the 1960s and 70s, pretty much. And obviously here, where everybody gets involved in Cuba when you go to school, because during the school time, you not only study the regular classes, but also you take emphasis on Cuban history, which is obviously a very political subject. And if you approach it in the right way, you talk about values of socialism. So we have some class called like kind of civic class, in which basically you learn about what makes us different as a human beings and what kind of values we want to promote and we want to practice, such as solidarity, social justice, and others. But you really get involved in politics when you actually grow up. My first experience in politics was actually in college. I mean, my real experience as an adult in college when students get the opportunity to organize themselves and to participate actively in the constructions of the society. One of the situations that happen when you're in college is what's going to happen when you finish college. When what you're going to do to your society, what's going to be your contribution, and how you're going to participate in. And it's a very important decision in your life, and everyone, not only in Cuba but around the world. What kind of jobs you're going to get, and what is the purpose of your life? It's only to get a compensation. It's the only purpose of your life to get paid, or you want also to develop your talents and help others. So, and obviously, the political, international and national life influence. In my case, I went through the difficult 1990s here in Cuba, which is when everything changed in the world. The collapse of the Soviet Union, collapse of all the Eastern European socialist countries. At that time is when you start to see, what Cuba had to offer in terms of being different than the Soviet experience. And that's when you learn about the roots of the history, and you learn about that socialism is something very new in history, what you're seeing is a number of experiments. And that's when you look at the experiments in Vietnam, the experiment in China, the experiment on North Korea, and other countries. In the case of Cuba, the experiment is always also looking at the reality of Latin America. So the Nicaraguan Revolution was an important experiment, and recently what happened in Venezuela. So this is a little bit about me. Basically, I live with my two daughters, and I do research on U.S.-Cuba relations, and I also run a food blog. That's one of my pastimes. And I have a little organic garden in my home. That's what I dedicate my weekends and on my free time to harvest some of the food. It's an important situation in Cuba because we need to produce more food. We import a lot. Unfortunately, we import a lot of food. And so there's a call by the government that everybody should produce some food. So I joined to that production. And I fortunately have a big backyard where I have avocados, mango, bananas, and guava, and other fruit trees, and also some fresh vegetables. That's another of my pastime. I had the opportunity to spend some time in the United States and learn about the U.S. politics. One of my specialization in college was actually to study the United States and to study not only the politics, but the history, the culture, and the implications of the nearness of Cuba to the United States, and having a revolution in Cuba, and having right next to the most powerful country from the military point of view, from the economic point of view, and also from the cultural point of view. It's a strong influence for not only from the world, but especially for Latin America. That's a little bit about myself. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
Oh, no, that was great. Very fascinating, interesting background. Thanks for sharing that about yourself. So before we get into the really deep questions, so a lot of our listeners might be unfamiliar with even some of the basic facts and sort of the basic context of the Cuban Revolution. So if you can try, I know this is a big question, but if you can try to briefly kind of talk about what was the Cuban Revolution initially, and kind of try to summarize, if you can, sort of the trajectory that it has taken since the event of the revolution, and then through these past decades up to the present, because, you know, the Cuban Revolution had profound historical implications around the world, and it's gone through a lot of changes and has developed in a lot of different ways.
That's correct. Actually, it's very important to look at the history to understand the present. And the Cuban Revolution actually goes beyond 1959. Most people here in Cuba see the revolution started in the late 1800s during the independence movement. Why we look at that? Because the independence movement in Cuba was a little quite different than the rest of the region, the rest of Latin America. In the most countries in Latin America were basically fighting the colonial power of Spain, and to establish a new system, but not changing the basis of that system. In the case of Cuba, was one of the few independence movements in the world that actually was demanding the end of slavery. So the slavery issue was linked to independence. And slavery issues were not even discussed in any countries in the region during the independence war. The second demand, besides dismantling slavery, was to establish a society based on social justice. Social justice in the 1800s was a very radical issue. It's still a radical issue, but at that time was very unusual. And one of the main leaders of this independence movement in Cuba was José Martí. José Martí was a young Cuban who his parents were from Spain, and he was very early in her life founded a newspaper in which he and others start to discuss and debate what kind of Cuba they want when they become independent. And José Martí spent a few years in the United States, 14 years, I believe, where he learned a little bit about the expanding of that country in Latin America. We're talking about late 1800s. So the independence war was actually not only demanding to be independent from Spain, but also was demanding the end of slavery and establishing society based on social justice. A lot of people who fought the Spaniards were actually runaway slaves, former slaves, or black Cubans free black Cubans who joined very poor, who fought with machetes, who fought without horses with the Spaniards. And that's important because that unified the independence movement not only in the Creole class, which is happening in the rest of Latin America. Most in Latin America was the Creole class that was established after the Spaniards were removed, and to pretty much maintain the same kind of system, but in hands of the Creoles or the people who were born in that area. In the case of Cuba, that fight was very long. It was a very bloody fight, and the Spanish army put most of the best army in Cuba to fight the Cubans. 100,000 troops were in Cuba, outnumbers the independence movement. And so we have basically two major wars. One that lasted 10 years and that end up in an agreement, in a peace agreement, that they didn't lead to Cubans to win the independence. Not until 1898. This is almost the 20th century, 1898, when the Cuban Mambises were the name of the independence movement. They were able to. They were about to defeat the Spaniard. The U.S. was expanding, and the U.S. see as a threat this independence, so declared the war to Spain. So you probably study in high school in the United States the Spanish-American War. We call them here the Cuban Spanish-American War because actually it was fought in Cuba by Cuban troops. But generally you study that as the Spanish-American War. So you probably remember the explosion of the main ship and the declaration of war from the United States to Spain. And the United States defeated Spain in less than 6 months. The United States, for the first time, was able to prove his powerful navy, and were able to take over Cuba from 1898 to 1902. So Cuba was occupied. The whole independence movement was frustrated and was aborted basically by the occupation of the United States. So that's why we say that the revolution began really in the 1800s, because in the 1800s we have people like José Martí who were envisioned a society based on values that had to do with what we are building now, which is socialism, and an anti-imperialist. José Martí was able to see that the United States was expanding, and the main reason of the United States expanding Latin America was basically to take over. At that time was Puerto Rico and Philippines. As you know, Puerto Rico is still a colony of the United States. And the Philippines, the United States maintained a U.S. military base until recently. And the influence of the United States in the Philippines is still very strong. So in 1902, there was a constitution written with the groups in Cuba that allied the United States. In Cuba, at that time, there was a beginning of a movement of people who want to be annexed to the United States, that want to be part of the United States, either similar to Puerto Rico or just become a new state of the United States. That movement began actually at that time. And those people generally were people who were linked economically to the United States, people who had businesses, people who have large farms that were not only economically related to the United States, but also culturally to the United States. So from 1902 to 1959, what people call in the Republic, and we call it here the new colonial period, because Cuba was never really independent until 1959. And that's why we don't celebrate here in Cuba the May 20 Independence Day that some people wanted to make us believe that we were independent. Going through quickly to 1959, basically 1959, Fidel Castro and all the young people were able to articulate the feelings of the majority of Cubans of being anti-imperialist, trying to accomplish the independence that was never happened in the 1800s. And Fidel Castro was inspired by José Martí. When he did his first attack to the Moncada and he was arrested, he said publicly that the intellectual author of all this revolution was José Martí. So in order to understand Cuba today, in order to understand the revolutionary process of Cuba, we have to study José Martí. And that is a huge difference comparing with other socialist movements, because our socialist experience here had to do with a long history of struggle for independence and sovereignty and social justice. In the early years of the revolution was the anti-imperialist feeling and the position was it was such a big majority of people who supported the revolution became very radical quickly till 1961, when Cuba officially declared itself as a socialist country, as a country that was going to build socialism, and Bush's make it very radical at that time. We have to remember that we're during the worst period of the Cold War. We got the 1950s McCarthy period, anti-communist sentiments that was promoted in the United States. So having a communist country, a socialist country in the backyard of the United States was a very delicate and dangerous issue. And you also remember the 1962 missile crisis. We were about to go to a nuclear war. Because when Cuba became independent in 1959, thanks to the Cuban Revolution, all countries in Latin America decided to break diplomatic relations with Cuba as pressure by the United States. That was the first pressure that the United States was making. Every single country except Mexico, they broke diplomatic and commercial economic relations with Cuba. So Cuba was pretty much isolated from the world, and that's when Cuba started to look at the Soviet model. And that's when the Soviets said, look, if the United States is not going to buy your sugar, we're going to buy your sugar. And instead of, and in exchange of buying your sugar, we'll send you oil. So Cuba got a preferential trade with the Soviet blocs during the 1960s that allow Cuba to become economically, some sort of economical stability and be able to push for all the political changes that the revolutionaries want. One of them, the first changes that happened in Cuba during the 1960s was the agrarian reform. That means giving the land to the producers, to the farmers. A second important change was the literacy campaign. At that time, Cuba has a population of a little bit more than 6 million inhabitants, and around 1 million people learn how to read and write in less than a year. That was a very successful campaign, run not only by teachers, but run by young students who went to the countryside mostly to teach others how to read and write. In the 1960s, a lot of historians are called as the original product of the revolution, where most changes were made in Cuba, the most radical changes. So the 1970s is when Cuba became closer to the Soviet bloc. And when I say Soviet bloc, I mean the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and all the Eastern European countries, in which trade covering 80% of the Cuban economy. And not only it was an economic tight, but also they became more political tight. And that's when Cuba had much more influence of the Soviet experience. A lot of Russians came here to work. A lot of Cubans went to the Soviet Union to study. A lot of Cubans were sent to the Soviet Union to study different careers, and not only to learn Russian, but also to be trained in Soviet colleges. And so there was probably one of the closest periods between both countries. In the moment that the 70s were still changes in Latin America. There were still revolutions, guerrilla warfare, and changes. However, I want to point something important. The role of Ernesto Che Guevara. Ernesto Che Guevara, he was one of the one who, after visiting the Soviet Union, became critical to the Soviets. Became critical, and he argued that we had to look for our own model here in Latin America. We had to look for our own heroes, for our own experience, and that the type of socialism that we have to construct, that we have to build, it had to be based on our own reality. That we could not import a socialist model from the Soviet Union. And this is important because Che Guevara made a very important contribution in that aspect. Because Che Guevara was able to warn us that the Soviet model could eventually collapse. And actually one of the first person who actually predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union was Ernesto Che Guevara in the 1960s. Che Guevara goes to fight in Africa, goes to fight in Bolivia, because he sees that also the success of the Cuban Revolution had to do with the success of other revolutions around the world. And he said socialism cannot be built in only one country. It has to be built in several countries to be able to compete with capitalism and also be able to get more strength and power to build his own model. So the death of Che Guevara in 1967 made an impact because at that time in Cuba, this is my own personal analysis, they have pretty much three tendencies. One tendency was Fidel's and Che Guevara's tendencies to look at Latin America, although Fidel was the leader to call for unity of all these tendencies. A lot of people think that in a revolution we all agree. No, We all, in revolutionary, we have different ways to see things. We have different perspectives and we have different analysis. And that happened in Cuba. The tendencies were sometimes confronting with each other, which is natural. And so we had this tendency of Che Guevara and Fidel and mostly the July 26 movement, who were more looking into Latin America, looking into what we do. Then we have a second tendency, which people were looking definitely at the Soviet model. You know, they thought that the Soviet model could be imported into Cuba. They thought that we could learn a lot about the Soviet model and establish some sort of socialist state similar to the Soviet experience, or even similar to some Eastern European countries. And the third tendency was much more a nationalist position. It was an anti-imperialist position, anti-imperialist to the United States. But they say, look, we can also look at Vietnam, look at China. Vietnam was a war. Cuba was in solidarity with Vietnam, so was not much to see as a developed socialist system, because it was a bloody war. The Chinese model, it was something attractive, but the conflict at that time between China and Soviet made those people not to be too enthusiastic about what the Chinese were doing. And Che Guevara and Fidel always say that we have to look and learn every single model. But this third tendency also look at the independence movement in Africa. At that time, most of African countries were fighting for the independence. So the result of the independence movement could be something that we should look at. So going to 1970s, the 70s, it was when the Cuban Revolution got more institutionalized. A new constitution was established in 1976 that gave a legal frameworks of the revolution. The institutions were pretty much established in order to defend and create this new model. In the 1980s is when Cuba, for first time, began to see some prosperity. Economically prosperity. The economic situation was very favorable to Cuba. The situation in Nicaragua started to change things because, as you know, in 1979, there was a revolution in Nicaragua, and Nicaragua and Cuba became quickly good friends. It was a very important experience because the failed experience in Chile in 1970 to 73, in which in Chile you have Salvador Allende, a socialist and Marxist president elected by the rules of the enemy. Fidel Castro goes to Chile. A lot of Chileans come to Cuba to study, to prepare for this new socialist state in Chile. But unfortunately, as Fidel predicted, because Fidel told Allende, said, look, the capitalists, they only accept the rules when they win. But when they lose, they're not going to accept the rules. And he was right. The military and the right wing and the United States overthrew elected government in just 3 years, in 1973, and established a bloody dictatorship. All these dictatorships that were in Latin America at that time, in the 1980s, create conditions for uprising movement, for a Marxist guerrilla groups that fought the dictatorships all over with the same goal, trying to achieve a revolution, a Marxist revolution. The case of Nicaragua, it was actually a good result. So Nicaragua and Cuba established an excellent relationship during the Reagan years, when Reagan began to become very offensive toward any communist or socialist movement, and when you have the rest of Latin America with right-wing dictatorship. So it were difficult times. However, there was another turning point of the history at that moment. It was the involvement of Cuba in Angola. Cuba sent troops, not only troops, but civilians too, to fight the South African regime in Angola and help Angolans to maintain the independence that they achieved. And that was another important turning point because Cuba was able to prove with the Angolan troops that the South African troops could be defeated. South Africa was the only country in Africa that had nuclear weapons, and it has a sophisticated army. Had the support of the U.S. and the most important Western power at that time. So the Nicaraguan Revolution, the war in Angola, when Angola, Namibia, South Africa, even Mozambique was actually somehow involved. They were turning point in the 1980s, but at the same time, in the 1980s, we have a rising of the right wings in the United States and Latin America. There was a strong confrontation. The 1980s, that's another important event that only happened here in Cuba, which is called the rectification process. In the mid-1980s, Fidel himself, with other leaders of the revolution, launched a campaign to rectify the mistake that we have made. This rectification actually became before perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union. And this is important because that was a way to do a self-criticism. That was when Fidel said, look, we have achieved a lot of great things in Cuba, but also we have mistakes. We have made mistakes. We have problems. We have problems that we have to solve ourselves. This rectification process, actually officially we call the rectification process in peacetime. It was a movement inside of the revolution to change everything that it was not working well. One of the issues at that time was bureaucracy. That bureaucracy has increased enormously in Cuba, and it was becoming a problem. So we have a bureaucratic, some sort of bureaucratic class of people who were sitting in a desk and making things difficult for the people, as bureaucracy everywhere. But so bureaucracy was a problem. Another problem that Fidel was able to see was all these young people in the 1960s were becoming older. The revolution already had more than 20 years of experience, and those people who were in the 30s, they were already in the late 50s. So there was a call to call more young people to get involved, in leadership positions. Another demand in this rectification process was the role of women and the participation of women in Cuba, even though Cuba had achieved a lot of great things in terms of women's rights. It was early during the revolution was created the Federation of Cuban Women, and a lot of changes in favor of women, but still women were unrepresented in the power of the revolution, in the National Assembly, in the Council of the State, etc. And the other demand was for non-white Cubans, or the black or mulatto Cuban, who also were underrepresented in the leadership. So all these demands, all these changes, all this criticism that Cuba made himself, it was a way to move forward and to move forward and say, look, we have a great experience, but we have to make changes. We have made mistakes, and we have to criticize ourselves, and we have to carry that. That happened in the mid-1980s. Late 1980s, the Soviets were facing problems, and the Eastern European countries also were facing problems. And those problems were leading to very radical changes that a lot of people didn't even imagine that could happen. I was very young, but I remember people saying that the Soviet Union will never collapse. It's like saying, look, the United States is going to collapse tomorrow. It's hard to believe that could collapse in the common sense idea. So in the 1980s, I'll just to make the story a little faster, the Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989. The peace agreement were made in Angola to end the war and to finally push South Africa away from Namibia that became independence, and Angola, who actually retained independence. And then the Nicaraguans revolution, they have election in 1990, and they lost through the rules of the enemy. The whole opposition got together, and the Sandinistas lost. And the Soviets started having their own problems. So from 1989 to 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, things began to change in Cuba. We have George Bush in the United States, and this is important. So in order to understand Cuba yesterday and today and tomorrow, we always have to study the relation with the United States. We're only 90 miles from the United States. So you take a flight here, 45 minutes to get to South Florida, and the relation with the United States are crucial to be understood in order to understand the reality of Cuba today and in the future. So George Bush was there, and the collapse of the Soviet Union meant big change for Cuba, because Cuba lost more than 80% of the trade So that means that just to take it to a practical issue, you go to your job tomorrow and your boss tells you that tomorrow you're going to get only 20% of your paycheck and you need to live with that. That happened with Cuba. Cuba overnight lost 80% of the trade and the economy crashed. The economy collapsed, basically. From 1991 to 93, the economic growth in Cuba was down on more than 30%. That means for Cubans, a new reality very distant to what most Cubans experienced in 1980s. A prosperous economy, easy life, people that were able to consume what they want. Children of workers and farmers could get their PhD without paying. You have a good established healthcare system, a good cultural life, a good sport life. Cuba was, in 1991, held the Pan American Games and was the #1 country in the region. Cuba was competing with developed countries in the Olympics in those years because Cuba was booming in many aspects. This situation in Cuba made for the daily Cuban a very difficult life. It means blackouts because Cuba didn't have oil to produce electricity, shortage of food, and crisis of all types. So people call Cubans are great by putting names to these things, like the rectification period, the literacy campaign period, etc. And in the 1980s, Fidel himself baptized this period as the special period. A special period, it wasn't really nothing special about the period, but it was special because it was a unique, a different period in which Cuba was practically left alone. No Soviet trade, and didn't have anybody to trade, and the blockade was tightened, the measure, the aggressions against Cuba increased, and the United States see that crisis as an opportunity to overthrow the revolution. In fact, in Miami, there were people who had the suitcases ready to come back and establish capitalism in Cuba, because the word every day was saying that Cuba would not resist more than a few months with that type of economy. So the government at that time, led by Fidel Castro, made basically three main challenges. The first challenge, it was the resistance. The leadership of Cuba said, look, we're going through difficult times, worse times, horrible times, but we need to ask you to resist because we're not going to surrender. We're not going to give up. We're going to resist no matter what, and even if we have to cook with wood on the street. In fact, in 1993, which is one of the worst years of this period, 93, 94, 95, probably those three worst years, Cubans were ready to cook with wood. We're ready to cook on the street and with wood, with whatever they had. So the first call was resistance. And fortunately at that time, the revolutionary values were still very strong, and there was still a generation that was willing to sacrifice everything for the revolution, and the leadership of Fidel Castro that called for unity. And that's something very important because he learned it from Jose Marti. Jose Marti said the only way that Cuba could survive right next to the United States is actually by building unity. And building unity is not easy, even in a revolutionary process. In a revolutionary process, you have different tendencies. You have different ways to approach the problems. You have different ways to deal with the problems. This period of this moment of resistance, it was actually successful. Cuba was able to prove to the world that was able to resist. Of course, Cuba made changes, and one of those changes was to allow foreign investment in Cuba. They became a strong campaign to reestablish diplomatic and trade relations with Latin America and with the rest of the world. Remember that in the 1990s, Cuba still was very isolated diplomatically. Was no member of most of the international organization. Cuba began to join to this international organization, began to see, look, we have different government with different ideas, but we can have good diplomatic relations. And also the 1990s was a different period for Latin America. Most of the dictatorships, the right-wing military dictatorships were going to the end. And we're going to the end, and there was a new period in political life. The second challenge that was established at that time was, besides resistance, was okay. We need to develop. We need to develop economically. We need to figure out how economically we're gonna get out of this crisis. And this crisis, and that's where Cuba started to pass various measures. For first time, we saw taxation in Cuba. We had some experience of self-employment. That means some small private business. And it was at the time that Cuba also started to look at the Chinese and the Vietnamese model. Myself, I went to Vietnam I believe in 1996. I went to Vietnam, and I went to all the way from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City. But I went the main purpose to an economic conference and to see the experience of Vietnam, to see what was working for Vietnam, what was working and what wasn't working. And so in 1990, this new tendency was like, well, we need to find allies, learn from different experiences, but we need to get out of the crisis. So the second challenge was to develop economically, and Cuba, in fact, was able to develop economically. Tourism, various economic reform allowed Cuba to gradually start to get out of the economic crisis of the 1990s. The third challenge at that time was, okay, we resist, we develop our economy, and we make all the changes that we need to develop our economy. And the third is, what kind of socialism we want to create? And that's, it seems like a philosophical question, but it's a real question, because when you don't have paradigm, when you have a model to look at, and when you model that you look at of your big brother, the Soviet Union, actually collapsed, you need to create your own. You need to look at your own roots. You need to look at your own experience and say, look, we should be able to develop our social society in our own terms. And that's why, again, people start to read Che Guevara. Che Guevara was already passed away in the 1960s, but most of his legacy was written. Che Guevara was able to read. Most of his speeches were recorded, and so his legacy was studied. And actually, Che Guevara was studied with the rectification process in the 1980s. But again, we have to look at different models and see what kind of socialism we want to create here in Cuba. So those three challenges were from the 1990s. These three challenges also were along with a new social revolution in Cuba that began, I would say, in the year 2000, led again by Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro said, look, we survived the economic crisis. In fact, we did. Cuba survived the worst. I didn't elaborate much, but people lost weight. People were hungry in the 1990s during the worst moment of the crisis. The situation was unsustainable in any country. If the Cuban situation was exported to any country in the world, that country will not survive no more than 30 days. Either a coup d'etat, a civil war, or an uprising, or something will happen that did not happen in Cuba. So in the year 2000, Fidel Castro led this social revolution, calling young people to get involved again. They train social workers, they train teachers again to retake those values and continue building a socialist society in this new condition. When I say new condition, it's because Cuba had to include in her model capitalist measures. For example, the farmers' markets are based on supply and demand. And they created taxation, they created some sort of privatization for some business. Foreign investment with capitalist country is a whole new world for Cuba. Dealing with tourism also. Tourism before 1990s, it was a right for everybody to enjoy recreation, vacation, and martial society. By 1990, it became a business. It became a way to bring fresh cash. And this fresh cash was important because we cannot forget the blockade. And the blockade is getting worse and worse since 1959 until Obama. But we have the year 2008, which was George Bush Jr. trying to smash the Cuban Revolution, even though when they saw that didn't collapse, and a lot of people in the right in the United States were disappointed that Cuba didn't collapse, the Cuban model didn't collapse. Cuba demonstrated to the world that it was still alive and that it was going to make adjustments. And those adjustments were going to be part of this process in which you have to make certain concessions in order to resist next to the most powerful country that blockade you.
The pink tide, like in Venezuela and Bolivia, generally had a huge impact on Cuba, especially in terms of trade and healthcare. So I wanted to ask if you could talk about how those experiments and thinking about socialism have influenced discussion within Cuba and how it made them rethink the post-Soviet period.
Yes, the Venezuelan Bolivarian Revolution, it was made a major impact in Cuba. And that was late 1990s, early 2000. Venezuela was a major oil producer. And the relations definitely helped Cuba, not only economically, but also politically in a way to look at Latin America. Venezuela and Cuba, Chavez and Fidel Castro were the leaders of calling for the unity of Latin America. And there were, at that time, a lot of progressive governments in Latin America. And Cuba with Venezuela were both leaders of calling for the unity. Organization UNASUR was created in South America, led also by Venezuela. And later was ALBA, created by the most leftist countries like Nicaragua, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela. And there was a favorable trade relation with Venezuela in which thousands of Cuba went to work in Venezuela, mostly health professionals, doctors, nurses, health practitioners, engineers, teachers. And in exchange, Cuba got oil, and Cuba also began to refine oil for the rest of the Caribbean. There were favorable relations with both countries that make an influence, a positive influence, and allowed both countries, and especially Cuba, to resist and also to create some economic growth. And Cuba was able to survive with tourism and was able to survive also by exporting certain goods like sugar, steel, lobster, rum, cigars, some coffee. And, it is funny because some people, let me make a parenthesis, say that Cuba exports all the evil things like sugar, rum, cigars, coffee, and anyway.
I enjoyed all of those things when I was in Cuba.
Yes. So that relationship with Venezuela definitely helped Cuba create some sort of a stability and some sort of a security, and also allow those two countries to be stronger to face the U.S. And especially in the early in the year 2000, where you have Bush, and Bush was losing Latin America. Because, we saw the experience of Evo Morales in Bolivia, then Correa in Ecuador. So it was definitely a favorable situation and a relationship that also shaped the idea of developing socialism. Because Venezuela experience is different experience than Cuba. Very different. I've been to Venezuela twice. I got to see the experience in Venezuela. Not only culturally, there's some differences, but also the way how they're doing it. Very different than Cuba. Of course, different times. We're in the 21st century. Cuba got to power to armed revolution. In a different period. That allowed to create a brotherhood, to say it, a sisterhood between both countries that made them stronger until the death of Chavez, which is another turning point of the history.
You mentioned the death of Chavez. Is that one of the things that came out of the death of Chavez was deteriorating relationship between the Venezuelan Communist Party and PSUV, which is the ruling party in Venezuela. I was wondering, Cuba is a communist party and it technically still has international relationship with all the communist parties in the world. I was wondering, has the split between the Venezuelan Communist Party and the Venezuelan Socialists affected the Cuban Communist Party's relationship in Venezuela?
Okay, in Venezuela, the Communist Party is a smaller party, part of this government coalition. Venezuela developed its own party, the Unified Socialist Party, which is not a traditional communist party. Because the Communist Party in Venezuela has always existed. It's existed for decades. And it's been supporting the Venezuelan process, even though it's critical to certain things. The Communist Party of Cuba has developed relations with all communist parties, not only with communist parties around the world, but also with some leftist parties or Marxist parties who are not in the most strict concept of being a communist party. And in fact, the Communist Party of Cuba had even relationship with liberal parties. Not only just a kind of diplomatic relationship. So important to understand that the Communist Party of Cuba is not an electoral party. And that's a big difference than Venezuela. The Socialist Unified Party in Venezuela is an electoral party. It's a vanguard party, it's a political party, but also it's electoral. It's participate in a multi-party election system. In the case of Cuba, our election system is not based on political party. It's based on independent candidates. You don't have to be members of the Communist Party to be elected in Cuba. You just need to get the vote. I'm not sure if you want me to talk a little bit about that.
Please do.
Yeah, please talk extensively about this. Give us a thorough overview of the electoral system. People don't know this.
The electoral system. The electoral system is based on the Constitution of 1976. Remember 1970, in which the closeness to understand it will be a parliamentary system. I mean, it's not a parliamentary system, but it will be the closest. That means we have basically 3 layers of the government here. The municipality, which is kind of the local government, the provincial, which is kind of the middle government, and then the national government. In the 3 layers of the government, you basically elect your representative in the base. 50% of the candidate that goes to any type of this election had to come from the base. That means go to your neighborhood. You go to a neighborhood meeting and you propose people and say, I propose this person because this person is very active, has good values, and can do a lot of things for our community, etc. That's the type of campaign we do. That means that you start to propose people at the base. Those people who are proposed at the base, they go to run with each other. The electoral law said you have to have minimum 2 candidates, a maximum of 7. So between 2 and 7 candidates by electoral district, because this is not run by electoral district, that generally each electoral district has approximately 20,000 people with the right to vote. And when I say people who have the right to vote, anybody who is over 16 years old automatically registered to vote. The only people who cannot vote in Cuba is somebody who have been denied their rights because I commit some felony. Is in prison with a felony and you lose the right to vote. But then everybody who turned into 16 years old, you automatically, with your ID, you have the right to vote, okay? And then anybody who had the right, who has over 21, is also had the right to be elected. That means that my neighbor who's a housewife could be elected, and also her husband who is a teacher can go and vote. Okay, so that's why we call them socialist democracy. Now, when I say 50%, that's by law. The 50% had to come from the base. That had to be in the municipality, in the electoral district, being proposed and being voted. As I mentioned, you need to have minimum 2 or maximum 7, and you go to the vote, and whoever gets the majority get elected, basically. Okay, and you became a delegate. A delegate is a political representative from the base. Now, when you go to the national elections, this is at the municipality, and then I remember I said provincial and national. When you go to the national elections, you have 50% of the candidate had to be elected at the base, and the other 50% of the candidate come from the 6 major mass organizations. Which one of these mass organizations? The Farmers Union. Farmers Union is a large organization of farmers linked with the revolutionary process in the 60s and 70s, etc. So that union can propose candidates. Okay. Second organization, the workers' trade union. That means all the unions around the country, they can propose candidates. Third organization, the Federation of University Students. That means that allow to have young people to be elected in the government. So that means all universities are organized by a federation of students, and they can propose candidates. Fourth organization, the Federation of Cuban Women, that assure that Cuban women will have candidates by slot. I mean, you can have women candidate in the base, you can have women in the trade union, but the Federation of Cuban Women will propose women candidates. Then you have the veteran organization, which are basically all the people who fought during the revolution, who fought in Angola, who fought internationalists, etc. They have their own organization and they can propose candidates. That means you can have, generally, are older candidates or people who have that experience at work, etc. So all this organization, they can propose 50% of the candidate, and with the 50% of the candidate that come from the base, you have elections. Those elections, the national election happen every 5 years in Cuba, and the local election happen every 2.5 years. To elect a National Assembly, which is called here the National Assembly of People's Power, that's the official name, the National Assembly of People's Power, that means the parliament, it's elected every 5 years with the votes, the national votes of all the candidates that come from the mass organizations and the base. When you elected this parliament or this National Assembly that is based by electoral districts, based on 20,000 people in each electoral district in the country, you develop a National Assembly of around 600 deputies or 600 delegates or 600 Congress people. This parliament elects the Council of the State. The Council of the State is the executive power in Cuba. In Cuba, we have basically three powers, independent powers: the court, the tribunal, which is the one who, like any other country, who implements, interprets the law. Second, you have the legislative power, which is in this case is the National Assembly. And the third is the executive, which is at the Council of the State. The Council of the State has one president and a number of vice presidents and a number of members. Now, this recently changed because we added with the new constitution, and this is something we need to talk to, because we just changed it 2 years ago, a new constitution with, as a result, a huge debate, and I want to talk about it, and a referendum, in which we create a new figure in the government, which is the prime minister. The prime minister. The prime minister is an appointed figure. It's not elected figure. Appointed by the Council of the State and ratified by the National Assembly. The president of Cuba and the vice presidents, and I say vice presidents in plural because Cuba has one first vice president and then several other vice presidents, 5 vice presidents, which is mainly the Council of the State, are elected in the National Assembly. Now, the Communist Party had nothing to do with the electoral system, nothing to do. The Communist Party is considered a vanguard party, a political guide of the revolution. Today, we have approximately between the youth and the adults organization, we have approximately 1 million members of the party. The current Cuban population is a little bit more than 11 million. So we're talking about 10% of the population, or a little more than 18% of the adult population. So that means the majority is not member of the party. To become member of the party in Cuba, first of all, you have to be a good student or a good worker. So you have to have certain personal qualification, just to say it. That means that you have to show a commitment with the political process, but a commitment with the political and philosophical values of the revolution. That means you have to be a decent person. That means you have to be a good person, just to say it in a colloquial language. That's how you join. You can request it, or somebody can propose you to join, and you join generally when you are young people to the youth organization, and then you move to the Communist Party. The youth organization is from 16 through 35 approximately, and when you're 30, you can be generally you can be both a member of the Communist Party and the youth organization, so on. But let me just make it very clear: the Communist Party has never participated as an electoral organization. In fact, in the parliament, you have members of the parliament who are not members of the current Communist Party. And in fact, you have a representative in the National Assembly who are Christians, who are pastors. We have, I believe, in the current National Assembly, there are 3 pastors. Yes, it's a minority, but you have 3 Christians who are members of the party, who have a different philosophical position on terms of life, but they are elected because they were popular in the base, because they're committed to the country, because they share values. Christianity and socialists, we share values. They share, for example, the value of solidarity, the value of social justice. So there's a number of things. That means that you don't have to have a Communist Party ID to either vote or to either get elected. It's true that the tendency in the National Assembly, you see more people members of the Communist Party than non-members of the Communist Party. That's true. That's a very simple reason. Because when you're a member of the Communist Party, you're supposed to have better characteristics to be elected, supposedly. And that means you have to be a good worker. You have to be a good student. You have to actively participate in your community. You have to show your values with others. So generally, because there are some members of the Communist Party who are corrupted, there are some members of the Communist Party who are opportunists. That means that they just doing it because everybody's doing it, or because or maybe they don't really believe it. But the tendency is, yes, a member of the Communist Party would be someone who will be respected in their community. Okay, so the role of the Communist Party in Cuba, it is to guide philosophically, politically the revolution by having an strong organization that is actively in every segment of the society. That means in every segment of society, you will see a communist. A member of the Communist Party, because there's some communists who are not members of the Communist Party. I know people who I know are officially members of the Communist Party, but they're more communists than actually a member. So, and here we have the term of revolutionary. Generally, most people in Cuba identify themselves as revolutionaries than a communist, because a revolutionary is a much broader term. That means you don't have to have a Communist Party ID to be a revolutionary. To be a revolutionary, you are patriot. You defend your country. You defend your process. You are actively in your process, and you understand the revolution is a process. It's not something. It's not a finished product. Revolution is not a finished product, and that's how I see it myself. I mean, when some people say, "Can you explain Cuban socialism?" I said, "Well, Cuban socialism is in a process. We're constructing, we're building socialism. We have not achieved a lot of things. I mean, if I look around in Cuba, there's a lot of things that don't fit the theoretical lecture or the theoretical reading of what a socialist system is. That's why I said we're in a process, we're contracting, we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to figure it out. It's not socialist. To me, the socialist system is not finished. It's not something that we can say, okay, this is how we are now, and this is how we can be analyzed. No, it is a process, and it's a process that might take probably years or decades. We're trying to transform 500 years of slavery, colonial power, capitalism. We're trying to build socialism where most countries in the world are capitalists. Most countries, the big majority in the world is a capitalist. It's based on capitalist ideas. Going back to the electoral system, every 5 years. So what happened? What happened with Fidel Castro and Raúl Castro? Yes, Fidel Castro was elected president every 5 years since 1976 until he stepped down in 2006 when he got sick, and he voluntarily stepped down. And then the vice president at that time was Raúl Castro, and he took over, and then there were elections, and Raúl Castro was elected for 2 terms until Miguel Díaz-Canel, which is our president now, was elected, and he's serving his first term as a president. Another characteristic of the Cuban election, how people run. First of all, the electoral law does not allow campaign, and does not allow funding for a campaign, and does not allow promising. That means a candidate cannot go and meet with people and say, if you vote for me, I'm going to build a school. Or if you vote for me, I'm going to pass this law. You cannot make promises. You cannot make campaign in that way. The only campaign that's allowed in this process is the candidate can meet with the voters, one, to listen their concern, to let them know who they are, in case of they don't know, especially when in the national level, in the local level it's easier, but the national level. And 3, to show their curriculum. So the only thing that is published during the campaign is a curriculum. It's a resume of the history of that person. That means a small picture of that candidate with the education, with the labor, with the work experience, and with certain things that they've done in their life. For example, the delegate of my district is a teacher, participates in international mission in Venezuela, has a family with 2 kids. Of course, the age is 47 years old. That type of things are published, and they're published equally to every public place. When you go to vote, you basically elect whoever you think should represent your electoral district. That's pretty much what the electoral system is. It's a system that still could be better, could be improved. And I think we're in the process of improving that electoral system. In fact, this ongoing discussion about how to make our elections much more democratic. And in the debates of the Constitution, it was for years debates of those issues. And some people obviously have criticism to certain electoral process, and they're all legitimate questions.
Tu mano gloriosa y fuerte